A routine grocery shopping trip unexpectedly turned into an unforgettable standoff when an elderly woman confronted rapper Snoop Dogg with a comment that shook the air. Her words were more than offensive. They sparked a cultural reckoning. What Snoop said in response wasn't just powerful, it was transformative. It was a regular sunny afternoon in Compton, California. The grocery store buzzed with the usual rhythm of daily errands, shoppers pushing carts, some deep in thought, others exchanging quiet conversations. Among them was Mrs. Thompson, an elderly woman in her late 70s. Adjusting her glasses near the produce section, she reached for a bag of apples. Her faded cardigan and neatly pinned silver hair gave her an unassuming appearance, but her next actions were anything but. Nearby, Snoop Dogg, dressed in his signature casual style with a blue Compton hoodie and jeans, calmly reached for a bag of oranges. Balancing his groceries in one hand and texting on his phone with the other, he blended seamlessly into the store's atmosphere. But the peace shattered in an instant. Mrs. Thompson turned sharply toward Snoop, her eyes narrowing and her lips tightening. Her voice rang out, loud enough to catch nearby shoppers' attention. "You people don't belong here," she said, her tone dripping with disdain. Then, in a sharp, cutting voice, she added, "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The store fell silent, the usual bustle replaced by an uncomfortable stillness. Shoppers froze mid-motion, some exchanging uneasy glances while others pretended not to hear. The tension was tangible. Snoop paused, his fingers hovering over his phone, his brow furrowed, and for a moment it seemed like he might respond immediately. But instead he inhaled deeply, his expression unreadable, as though weighing every word before speaking. Mrs. Thompson stood firm, her grip on the bag of apples unwavering, her stance defiant. She didn't apologize, her demeanor suggesting she expected no challenge. Around them, the atmosphere grew heavier. A young mother quickly guided her child away, while an older man near the potato display looked on nervously, unsure of what would happen next. An employee stacking bananas froze mid-motion, uncertain whether to intervene. Even the cashier leaned forward slightly, trying to glimpse the unfolding scene. The crowd grew still, silent witnesses to the confrontation that was now impossible to ignore. Snoop looked at Mrs. Thompson, his expression calm but thoughtful. Countless responses ran through his mind. He could shout, argue, or walk away. But none of those seemed right. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, yet he didn't let it break him. Instead, he took a deep breath, shifted his basket to his other hand, and straightened his posture, his presence commanding attention in the tense silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and deliberate, cutting through the thick atmosphere. "Ma'am," he began, his tone measured, "do you even realize what you just said?" His question wasn't confrontational, it was introspective, as though giving her a moment to consider her words. But Mrs. Thompson didn't pause for reflection. "I said what I said," she retorted sharply, her voice rising. "This is my country. People like you don't belong here." That was the breaking point. A young woman near the bread aisle, Jessica, gasped audibly, and the quiet murmur of the crowd grew louder. Despite this, Snoop remained composed. He didn't raise his voice or take a step closer. Instead, he allowed the pause to linger, letting her words resonate with everyone present. "All right," he said finally, nodding slowly. His calm demeanor was almost unsettling in its power. "Let's talk about that since you brought it up." The room collectively held its breath, anticipating his response. But the storm that followed wasn't the one anyone expected. With deliberate care, Snoop set his basket down on the floor and shifted his weight. His calmness was magnetic, drawing the attention of everyone around him, even those pretending not to listen. He fixed his gaze on Mrs. Thompson, not with anger, but with a quiet determination that made her shift uncomfortably. "You said I don't belong here," he began, his voice steady but firm. "Let me tell you something about where I come from." His words carried weight, each one deliberately chosen. "My great-great-grandfather was born right here in California, But before that, my ancestors were brought here against their will, treated like animals to build this state, this country you're standing in." Mrs. Thompson's lips tightened, but she stayed silent. The crowd, however, was captivated. A man near the dairy section who had been scrolling on his phone put it down entirely. An older couple whispered to each other but couldn't look away. Snoop continued, his voice gaining momentum. "My grandfather fought in Korea, fought for a country that sent him to war but wouldn't give him the same rights when he came back. He couldn't sit at the same counters or drink from the same fountains. But he stayed. You know why? Because he believed in this country's promise, even when it didn't believe in him." A hush fell over the store, even the hum of the refrigerators seeming to fade. Snoop's tone softened slightly, but his words remained powerful. "And my parents? They fought too, not with guns or fists, but by being who they were. They raised me to respect everyone no matter what they look like. My mother's a teacher. She spent her life teaching kids about love and equality. My father's a community leader, the kind of man who'd stop on the side of the road to help a stranger. Someone like my father," Snoop continued, "would stop to help you if your car broke down, no questions asked." He let his words sink in, his gaze unwavering as he looked at Mrs. Thompson. "And yet you're telling me I don't belong here, that I should go back to Africa?" He shook his head slightly, his voice carrying a hint of sadness now. "Ma'am, I am just as much a part of this country as you are, maybe even more, because my family paid for it in blood, sweat, and tears." Mrs. Thompson's face reddened, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her apples. She opened her mouth as if to say something, but the words never came. Instead, she fell silent, her lips pressed tightly together. Snoop stepped back slightly, his composure unbroken. Addressing the crowd now, he said, "I could have walked away. But what good would that have done? Ignorance doesn't change in silence. It's on all of us to be better than this, to rise above words like those." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The crowd remained still, the silence almost deafening. Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted, a mix of anger, embarrassment, and something else that resembled shame. She glanced around as though searching for someone to back her up, but no one stepped forward. A middle-aged man wearing a baseball cap, Derek, finally broke the quiet. "He's right," Derek said, his voice firm but gentle. "We've got to be better than this." His words seemed to unlock something in the room. An older woman near the frozen food section, Mrs. Garcia, nodded slowly. "My dad fought in that same war," she said softly, her voice quivering. "And he always told us the only color that mattered was the red in the flag." The murmurs grew louder. A young cashier, no older than 20, named Ava, called out from her station. "I've never seen someone handle a situation like that so gracefully." "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson," now visibly flustered, gripped her cart tightly. The defiance in her eyes had faded, replaced by something quieter. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer, almost hesitant. "I didn't mean..." But she stopped herself, unable to finish. Snoop turned to her, his expression gentler now. "It's not about what you meant," he said calmly. "It's about how it came across. Words matter. Actions matter even more." At that moment, a man near the deli counter, James, began clapping slowly. The sound was hesitant at first, but it grew, others joining in until it swelled into a wave of applause. People weren't just clapping for Snoop's words, they were clapping for the courage it took to confront hatred with dignity. Mrs. Thompson looked around one last time, her face pale. Without another word, she wheeled her cart toward the exit, her shoulders slumped. As she left, a few people approached Snoop to offer their support. One woman, Tanya, placed a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you for saying what needed to be said," she told him quietly. Snoop gave her a faint smile, lifting his basket back into his hand. "Sometimes," he said, almost to himself, "it's not about winning or losing. It's about making sure people hear the truth." The crowd slowly began to disperse, the charged tension in the air replaced by a quiet sense of reflection. Some looked inspired, others deep in thought, but everyone seemed changed in some small way. Though the moment had passed, the impact of Snoop's words lingered. What had unfolded in that grocery store would leave a lasting impression. The grocery store felt different, quieter, more contemplative. Snoop finished his shopping, his steps slow and deliberate, as if he were processing the events that had just unfolded. The weight of the moment hadn't shaken him, but it had left him thoughtful. At the checkout counter, Ava, the young cashier who had spoken up earlier, scanned his items with a hesitant smile. "What you said back there," she paused, then continued softly. "It meant a lot. Not many people stand up like that, especially with so much grace." Snoop returned her smile, his tone warm. "Sometimes grace is the only way to break through anger," he said gently. "Anger just builds walls." Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot of Compton. As Snoop walked to his car, he noticed Mrs. Thompson sitting in hers, gripping the steering wheel tightly. For a moment, he considered walking over to her but decided against it. Some lessons take time to sink in, and he had already said what needed to be said. Later that evening, Snoop sat with his crew at his home in Compton, recounting the day's events. They listened intently, nodding in agreement. "You did the right thing, Snoop," said Leroy, one of his closest friends. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching. People like her, they don't change overnight. But you planted a seed. That's all you can do sometimes. Plant the seed and let it grow." Snoop nodded, Leroy's words resonating deeply. He realized that while the encounter had been uncomfortable, it had also been necessary. Ignorance doesn't change unless it's confronted, and silence only allows it to spread. Across town in West Compton, Mrs. Thompson sat at her dining table, staring at an untouched plate of food. Snoop's words echoed in her mind, each one chipping away at the armor of her assumptions. She thought of her grandchildren, of the world they were growing up in, and for the first time she felt something unfamiliar: doubt. In the days that followed, the story of what had happened at the grocery store spread throughout the neighborhood. People spoke of Snoop's response, his courage and the dignity with which he handled the situation. It became more than just an incident, it became a lesson, a reminder of the power of words and the importance of standing up for what's right. Snoop didn't seek attention for his actions, but the ripples they created moved through the community in unexpected ways. Strangers approached him to share their gratitude and their own stories of prejudice and resilience. His quiet stand had sparked conversations that many had long avoided. Mrs. Thompson, too, began to change. It wasn't immediate, but she found herself questioning the belief she had clung to for so long. She didn't know if she'd ever see Snoop again, but if she did, she hoped she'd have the courage to apologize. Disclaimer: all stories shared on this channel are entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes. We advocate for a world where everyone is treated equally under the law, and society continues to grow in fairness and understanding. Any resemblance to real events, individuals, or organizations is purely coincidental